Wow, you are so accomplished. Amazing. So I just wanted to kind of talk about that for a bit. I know that you've, at some point earlier in your career, worked at Oxfam, and I'm curious to hear about the through line that connects you and your experiences in the coffee industry, and how that brought you to founding a venture capital firm.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's really awesome to be here. It's a little full circle moment for me. So I was at my mom's house a few weeks ago, before I knew this was happening, and I found this badge. It's from the Specialty Coffee Association 2006, although my first was 2003 in Boston, so it was 20 years ago. I was working for Oxfam in sustainability and fair trade, when fair trade certification kind of just got launched. And the origin there is that I was always very passionate about agriculture and farming. My grandfather immigrated from Germany, decades before I was born, but because he couldn't make it on his family farm. That was one side of the family. The other side of the family, my grandmother was just a prolific cook. She cooked with every single scrap and bone that she had in the kitchen. And a lot of our childhood was either outside gardening or around the kitchen table. So very passionate about agriculture. Fast forward to school at Boston University. I started the United Students for Fair Trade national campaign, and then on our campus we had a fair trade chapter, and this was 2000. We hosted a coffee farmer from Oaxaca named Lorenzo Jose. For whatever reason, I was asked to translate for him from Spanish to English. My Spanish, I would say, was book fluent at the time. And I was very moved by his story. And I really wanted to know if this thing called fair trade that I was spending all this time on campus, I was not going to parties because I was waking up early in the morning, canvassing the campus and all of that. I wanted to know if it was real. And so Lorenzo invited me to come stay with his family. I don't think he anticipated that was going to actually happen, but lo and behold, a year later, I showed up in Oaxaca at the co-op's offices. He was the president of the co-op at the time, and said, "Hey, remember me?" And we became very good friends. I spent a month with his family, and my question was, is fair trade having an impact? And this is a cooperative that at the time was, and they actually still are 20 years later, selling their coffee to Whole Foods. I actually found their coffee in the Whole Foods bulk bin near my parents' house after I returned from this program. But the answer I actually found was no. Fair trade was not sustaining the community. Actually, what was this very complex web of a transnational migration network, remittance money, lumber that was being sold from this pristine forest, organic honey production, and coffee. It was a combination of all those things. It was this diversified economy. And I became very, very interested in sustainable development. So that's how I ended up at Oxfam. I was there for 7 years, spearheading the sustainable coffee program with an amazing team. And a lot of what we did was engage with the coffee industry to think about practices. So when a lot of NGOs were campaigning outside of companies, we were definitely doing that, but we were also engaging directly with executives. And the other thing I found, this is like a blast from the past. Well, this is when I met Lorenzo at Boston University. 20 years ago, translating for him. This was our flyer. And then I also found this flyer, which pictures a farmer in Ethiopia who I met. It says, "Tell Starbucks, honor your commitment to coffee farmers." Because the other thing we were doing as a part of this campaign was not just how do you secure for your supply chain, but how do we help coffee producing countries protect their IP. So this is a big part of this campaign. So this was like my origin and passion in all this work, and then this is actually the thesis I wrote around what I learned in Oaxaca. So anyway, a lot of history there, but I would say that this informed the next 2 decades of my career in a lot of ways. The first is just being a builder, right? So I was so inspired by Lorenzo, his community, what they've built. We are still in touch 20 years ago. I brought my family to meet he passed away very tragically a few years ago, but I brought my family to meet his wife and their children a couple months ago. They're actually planting geisha trees, and I think we might do a little investment with them around that. And she's a builder. He was a builder. I just learned a passion for rolling up your sleeves and building. So we built this program out at Oxfam, which really was groundbreaking for the industry. It caused companies like Starbucks to start thinking about sourcing and build out their cafe practices. I went to Mars because I realized the power that these large companies have on commodities. Mars spends $1 billion a year on cacao, very similar dynamics to coffee. And so we built a program there thinking about sustainable sourcing. And then for various reasons, when I realized I kind of felt like I went as far as I could there, many reasons being because the supply chains are colonial. They're built on like colonialism, and they're built on commodities markets that are not structured for sustainability. I decided I want to build a business from the ground up, and I joined an entrepreneur who started a company called Farmer's Fridge, which actually offices right across from here, as the COO, and I built that business over a number of years. So what I really learned from my time with Lorenzo is if you have a vision, you just roll up your sleeves and figure out how to build it and challenge the status quo. So that was a big thing. So another big piece of this is, how do you challenge assumptions? How do you surface bias as you're thinking about building a team and building solutions? I felt that my early work in the coffee industry and later work in other industries, there's so much bias rife in thinking about who are the producers? Like the question that was asked earlier about how do you think about the producers and sustainability? There's so much asymmetry there, and so a big part of my time at Mars and building this program out was boots on the ground with farmers and traders who brought all of the knowledge to the table about how we were going to think about sustainability, behavior change, adoption, how things kind of evolve. So like challenging bias, surfacing bias, recognizing that we have it. I learned a lot of that through this journey. And then really looking for out-of-the-box solutions, right? I mean, you're having to do that in your businesses probably all the time because it's really hard to do what you're doing and, running retail stores, and you're talking about the restaurant industry. Those are really tough businesses. So how do we think about outside of the box? So all of that and kind of building businesses over time eventually led me to venture capital. I launched this firm 3 years ago with a colleague from business school. And what we do is we invest in very early stage entrepreneurs that are focused on technology and food and agriculture. Sometimes they have a product in revenue and sometimes actually pre-product. When I talk about product, it's mostly tech or biotech, and sometimes also it's physical products. And we are the anomaly in the venture capital industry because we're two women. So if you look at the stats of who controls capital, it's like less than 1%. It's going to be women or people of color. My co-founder is Latina. We dealt with a lot of bias. We were raising the fund, and then we really had to challenge a lot of our own assumptions as we were thinking about how do we build pipeline and make investment decisions. And what that's resulted in a few years later is we've invested in 16 companies so far. Almost 90% of the founders and CEOs we've partnered with, these companies are run by women and folks of color, and many of them women of color. And I think it's because we really thought differently at how we wanted to build our processes, what view and perspective we were bringing, how we'd welcome submissions from anybody building a business, and how we kind of review those businesses. So like the early days in coffee, and particularly my time on farms and with farmers and with growing communities, really informed like so much of this ethos.
That's amazing. Yeah. And I love that, that connection from your background, from coffee to what you do now.
Yeah.
And how that's just been so incredible.
Yeah.
So, next question. Now that we're talking about venture capital, may I ask you to please give us a primer on what venture capital is?
Yeah.
Also, how is it different from private equity? And what kind of companies go after VC funding or vice versa?
Yeah, so I have a question. Has anyone here taken outside funding for your business? Has anyone taken venture capital or private equity? Or is it debt funding? Or you're borrowing? Okay, let me explain. So, there's two main different forms of capital. Equity, which is basically when somebody invests in your business and they take a percentage of ownership in that business. And then there's debt, which is like, you think of it, go to bank and get a loan, although it's not obviously that easy. When you're an early stage business, particularly when you're pre-revenue or you have a bit of traction built up, but you haven't really proven the business out, you're not going to have the data you need to get a loan from the bank. And this is a lot of time when early stage venture capital or private equity investors will come in. The difference between venture capital and private equity at a high level is just at what stage your business is at when that capital comes in and how much ownership you're kind of giving up in the business at different stages. So when we come in and we say we're pre-seed and seed stage, this is very much the absolute earliest stage when a founder's taking capital. And a lot of what we're doing is we're betting on the team and the idea, right? There's really not a lot of other metrics we can look at. And we're knowing we're going to roll up our sleeves and help them build together, which is what I love doing every day. So that's early stage capital. Private equity will usually come in a little bit later, and they're looking at metrics like, are you EBITDA positive, and what is the management team like, and a lot of other questions that they can answer by your actual business because you have like years of data and your books have been audited and all of that. But we're coming in so early, We don't have a lot of that, so it really is like the riskiest stage to invest. I think it's the most fun. I also like playing poker, so I like taking risk. But it's fun, but this is really, you're hoping that founders are looking for investors at that stage. They really, what we try to help founders understand is what it really means to take capital from us at that stage, and how we want to partner with you to grow your business. We're not taking equity where we're taking like a controlling stake in the business. It's typically 1 to 10%, right? So the founders are still controlling that business. Sometimes there's not a board formed yet. Sometimes there is, and we join the board. But it really is about how do you help the founders and the founding team get set up for success. Yeah.
Great. Cool. So the decision to grow a business from a regional to a national scale is a huge one for founders and other senior leaders, but it also has the potential to significantly impact the employees at all levels of the organization.
Yeah.
Can you share examples of good leadership among companies you've worked with so far?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think one of the biggest things to think about is why you want to grow your business. I feel like Netflix has made, growing businesses quickly funded by venture capital a very sexy thing, and actually made it seem like it's more mainstream than it is. We're still talking about a very small percentage of businesses across the US that will take venture capital funding. I feel like Hollywood's also sensationalized, like the Theranos, the WeWork, the Uber story. There are stories of those types of founders. Those make really good Hollywood stories. But also, like, most businesses aren't kind of going through that process either, or the investor-founder relationship isn't necessarily that. So I feel like there's a lot of kind of misconception about what this capital is and how to use it and when it's appropriate. And the dangerous side of that is entrepreneurs will think like, oh great, I can, raise money, and like they're not really thinking about that actual form of capital. So I think being really aware of what your goals are for your business and why you want to grow is step number one. And like, what does growth mean? Because for some people, growth means you were sitting at Metrics Cafe and Roastery and they wanted to open one more, right? But maybe, and I have no idea, the founders actually are like, we want to build a national brand out of this, and our strategy is actually, this is our flagship, and we're really thinking about being consumer product. And so that's different capital. Like, one is basically more of a hospitality model, I think. I don't know, I don't fund cafes, but you're thinking a lot more about what Chad was talking about, right? The other is, I'm getting a product in a store, I'm thinking in a retailer, or I'm selling it D2C, although I wouldn't do that. I would get it in a retailer if you really want to grow a consumer product, because that's where everyone shops. And how do I, what kind of capital do I need to do that? I'm setting up with a co-manufacturer. You're doing things much differently than you would do it if it was just replicating a store. So I think with that backdrop, companies that I've seen grow successfully from regional to national brand. I can give you examples of companies that we haven't invested in, because we just started investing 3 years ago. So our brands are mostly still regional. Some have national distribution, but they haven't overcome that growth curve yet. But one I can think of is Siete Foods. Do you know this brand? How many of you know the brand Siete Foods? So they're selling gluten-free, grain-free tortillas, sauces, chips, etc. It's a Mexican-American family of 7, Siete, on the border. They grew up in, I think it was Laredo, Texas. And basically, they have an amazing story. One of the sisters was starting to have a lot of problems with her diet. And so she started creating the kitchen maybe a decade ago, and she created this almond flour tortilla that her story is, my abuela said, this is as good as mine. And her family started to get really into nutrition and changing their diet to support her, so that when they were at family gatherings, it's very cultural, she could partake in the family gatherings. And then they started to sell their tortillas locally, and they got into Whole Foods, and they kind of grew from there, right? So this is an example of a brand that has just done phenomenally well. But the goal from the beginning was, we want to get these products into retail distribution so that we can impact more consumers, right? This was like really the driving force of why they did what they did. And they're national. I would bet, if I had to guess, they're in over 10,000 stores at this point, maybe more, from Whole Foods to Costco. And they've done a really amazing job of staying very true to their brand's values. Like Nike, what this brand stands for. If you go to their website, it is very obvious, right? Family, quality, gathering, like it is all there. I don't know what their actual core values are, but that's kind of what jumps out to me, right? And you see it in the way that in everything they do. They have the Siete Juntos Fund where they just put $200,000 into maybe like 10 food truck businesses around the country, right? And a bunch of entrepreneurs applied and they supported them. And they do limited product launches from their website where they will send that direct to consumer. But the role of that is product testing, clearly. And then, as someone who's a fan of their brand, I then see them roll those things out nationally, right? So that's an example of a brand that I think has just done a phenomenal job of going from a small regional brand in Texas to national expansion, but with a really clear idea why. And, I'm imagining there have been a lot of bumps because they're producing their products through co-manufacturers. They're having to look for allergen-free facilities. They're using ingredients that aren't corn, wheat, soy, and sugar, the main ones that, that all processed foods are using. So that's been a really, really interesting story to follow. Another brand I'll share, actually we did invest in this one, is called Partake Foods. Have anyone heard of Partake? So this is another kind of diet-based consumer company. It's allergen-free treats for families, but starting with kids so everybody can partake, right? And this is a founder who has a really interesting background in CPG. She was at Coke and had her daughter. And her daughter was allergic to a lot of different things, like a lot of kids these days are. And so she started to create cookies, to bake cookies for her that she could consume and her friends could consume. They could all partake. And it kind of went on fire that way. She was selling out of her car. She was selling in local craft markets while at Coke. And then at some point, there was just so much traction building that she launched her business. And she's gone through a Series B stage of financing. And same thing, national distribution. But her goal really was, how do I build a national brand? Because what I want to do is impact as many families as possible, right, with this food. So I think really having the goal in mind is such a key and core component. And I know that these models are slightly different because they're not, coffee shops and retail shops. But I have actually seen other brands that went from a retail shop or a retail concept or a farmer's market brand or a food truck and then have launched national products successfully as well.
Yeah, that's amazing. I don't know about you, but I would definitely watch Netflix documentaries on those two brands.
I would as
yeah,
well.
So
Yes,
if Netflix, you're listening,
somebody should make those.
This is a great idea for you.
Yeah. Yes.
Great. So in addition to growth's impact on supply chains, the needs of a national scale business are different to those of a regional one when it comes to management, operations, and finance, and et cetera.
Yeah.
I imagine that some of the changes required seem easy in abstract settings and turn out to be difficult once you actually get there. Are there change management strategies and practices that business leaders can adopt early on that will help them adopt later when confronted with the need to change in ways that they did not anticipate?
Yes, I love that question. I love scaling and growing things. So it's I think the most fun part about it is the culture change and the shifts. And when you get it right, you really see your team and your employees just being able to grow tremendously and have opportunities that they may not have had elsewhere. I think there's a couple things. One, when we were growing Farmer's Fridge, one of the rules we had was it's just a rule of thumb, every time something doubles, it breaks. So we have to make flexible systems. So revenue, team size, going from 1 to 2, 2 to 4, 4 to 8, right? Systems just then start breaking. And so that, for us, what that meant was we had to have a growth mindset. You have to have structure because as you grow, your team, your people need to be why am I here? What am I doing? What am I contributing every day? Right? And you want to be able to use your team effectively and have people really feel, like they're doing their best at work every day. So they have to be clear on what they're doing. But also, you really have to have a team that's growth oriented because what you're doing today is not what you're going to be doing tomorrow. So when I joined Farmer's Fridge, the company had just closed a seed round of financing, and I was the first executive hire. It was the founder and I, and our production team and our delivery team, and then we started to kind of build out from there. And I guarantee, I can tell you, what the team was doing then and what I was doing then was not what I was doing 4 years later when we closed our Series C. So at that point in time when I started, if something broke on the night shift and we produced right on Lake and Ada, it was a couple blocks away from here, I was getting the phone call, right? And showing up with the night shift manager to figure out what was going on. What Farmer's Fridge does is makes fresh food but utilizes technology and data to really be able to reduce waste and produce food, make it kind of more accessible to a price point that is, the goal of this is to make that fresh food as accessible as a candy bar, right? So we had to be really attuned to the data and what we were learning from our customer bases through the fridges that we were selling our food. But then every night we were packing the food fresh. And in the beginning, those recipes, I mean, they were not optimized, right? So the food lasted 24 to 48 hours. Over time, as we brought in food science and we brought in, a team that had a little bit more experience in shelf life, for example, we could get to 5 to 7 days naturally through things like acids, limes, like think of like things in our kitchen that we put in our foods to make them last longer. But it took time to get there, right? So what I was doing on day one was not what I was doing in year 3. And that was true of everyone on our team and everyone who grew and scaled with the team over time. So I think that's a really important thing is early on, you've got to look for people with a growth mindset and also know that you're not always going to have the team with the growth mindset and or sometimes the company may outgrow some of those skills. And so this mantra of this hire slow and fire fast, we never want to talk about that. Obviously, it's uncomfortable, but it is actually really true because if you're building a team with a growth mindset and there's somebody who really is stuck and you've worked with that person, it can be very detrimental to the wider team. So I think it is like, how do you embed that mindset early? Another concept we talked about a lot there was giving away your Legos. And this was actually, it's a great blog post. You can Google it, I think by First Round Capital. But it's, as a company grows, how am I going to give things away? Because I can't hold and control everything. Imagine like you're the founder. Founders do this a lot. I don't know how many of you are founders, but founders do this a lot. You don't want to give things away. You don't want to trust people, probably because you've been burned before. But you got to find the people you can trust, and you have to give your Legos away if you want to grow. Again, if you want to maintain your shop and you want to have control of everything, you're just going to stay at a certain size. Your people probably aren't going to be happy either, but I don't know if they'll tell you that or not. But I think whatever size you're at, you got to learn to give away your Legos and trust people, right? So that's a really critical one. And then the last, very tangible thing I'll tell you guys to buy is a book called Traction by a guy, Gino Wickman. Have you heard of it? Yeah. So this has become just mantra. I love this book. It is a really flexible framework for getting your team aligned as a company grows. When you get to a certain point, you're probably going to bring the other people in and they're going to have all the national management experience. It's going to maybe look a little different, but you will have a journey getting from being a local business to regional business to national business. And I found that framework to be really helpful. And actually it's something that we use with all of our founders and our firm, as an investment firm, but we are also a startup and as an early company, we use that methodology as well. So I think it doesn't necessarily have to be that book, but what you should have is some kind of a framework where everyone knows the culture, the goals, the vision, the goals, and what am I here to do every day in a very simple way. And the culture doesn't mean I'm printing my core values on the wall. It's a lot of what you're talking about. It has to be lived and breathed by the founders, and you're hiring folks to understand it. And then at some point, maybe you're articulated on paper and you hire people against that culture, but it should be something really organic. And so I'd say, Traction is a great book to explain how to do this, but find some framework that helps you get really clear on why you exist, what you do, who you want to have on your team, and what do all those people kind of do every day.
Great, that's all good advice. Cool, so this is the last question. Last question, and then I'll open it up to questions. There you go. Okay. So other people have questions too. So the name of your firm, Supply Chain, suggests that there are ways for a company to take on investment and benefit its supply chain partners. From what you know of coffee supply chains, and I know you said it has been a while since you've worked in the industry, do you think roasters and retail businesses can share the risks and rewards of investment with suppliers? If so, how?
Yeah, I think this is the question I had the hardest time thinking about ahead of time because I want to say yes. My soul wants to say yes. In practice, I think it's really hard. And I think part of it is because of factors outside of all of our control and things that happened historically before any of us were here. But if we just factually look at what's happened in coffee growing communities and cacao growing communities over time, because these communities are reliant on a monocrop in large part, which is dependent on global markets, poverty in large part has persisted. I think there are stories of hope and of resilience, and a lot of times that's actually when incomes diversify in the community and when we're not solely reliant on a monocrop, and there's a lot of really good literature about this and there are a lot of good case studies. But I also don't want to suggest that coffee roasters and retailers have to solve everything. I mean, I think that's really hard. I mean, Oxfam, the organization I worked at originally in my career, is an international development agency. So you had to take into account policy, like governmental policy, local policy. I mean, there's just so, humanitarian crises, there's just like kind of so much wrapped into it. So I think there are examples of communities that have really built resiliency. I think it's actually really important to find partners as you're identifying sourcing communities or when you're in sourcing communities that can help with a more holistic picture. And I really do think that's where NGOs play a huge role, and or looking at governments where there is a pro kind of trade policy and there is some infrastructure support around growers. And you see variability in different origins, right? Rwanda, Ethiopia, Costa Rica, Vietnam, these origins are all going to look different, and that's because of the political economy. So I think this is just a really tricky one to answer, and I do think that it's possible to an extent, but this is where we have to be really holistic in our thinking and think outside the box and think about how to make it happen. A couple of things I've seen lately are companies talking a lot about carbon insetting. I don't think the mechanisms are there yet to help it happen, but what it means is that coffee systems can hold a lot of carbon, particularly if they're agroforestry systems, which is just amazing. It's beautiful. There's really great research that shows if you're cultivating coffee in an agroforestry system, you can keep the temperatures lower for longer, right? All of us are in this world, agricultural world, and particularly those of you in coffee, are going to be threatened by climate change, right? So I think that's one thing to consider, is thinking about agroforestry systems and what that does and how that supports farmers. And what carbon insetting is it's how do we account for and charge a premium and pass that premium to the farmer for the carbon they're holding in their system. Now what's complex there is if you're going to get precise about it, you have to measure all the factors on the farm. Soil and tree girth and canopy density and all that. But that is something really interesting that I've even seen companies like Google working on. How do you get the data, right, to really demonstrate the carbon held in these systems? So I do think that there are innovative approaches out there, but I think it's tough, and I also think that when all the onus is put on small business owners and small roasters, it's a little bit unfair, because there's a much larger industry out there that controls most of the trade that I think could be doing a lot more. So I don't know if that's an answer necessarily, or raises more questions, but I think it's a really important question for us to consider.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.